The Catechism of the Catholic Church reminds us that the whole liturgical life of the Church revolves around the Eucharistic sacrifice and the sacraments. Participation in what is called the sacramental economy is not optional for our sanctification. In fact, sacramental mediation provides the only means known to the Church whereby God creates saints. To put it differently, the sacraments afford the principal instruments by which the Christian believer meets or encounters Christ. This encounter, when effected in the Church of Faith and Sacraments, justifies us with God and safeguards us for life everlasting. Why do we speak about meeting Christ in the sacraments? The answer entails an account of how Catholic doctrine and practice interpret Christ's actual mediation within the Church. Catholics account for the scriptural revelation of Christ's mediatorship in terms of the incarnation itself as a union of God and man in the person of the Word. What theologians refer to as the hypostatic union, from the Greek word hypostasis, meaning person. The hypostatic union then stands at the center of everything that Christ communicates to his Church and through her to the world. As Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI has said, the many, us, go out and gather the whole. All that transpires in the life of Christ, the mysteries of his life, such as his nativity, his miracles, his passion and death, his resurrection, as well as whatever transpires legitimately within the Church of Faith and Sacraments, follows upon Christ's office as the one mediator. The Church then presents the divine plan for salvation in a way that acknowledges that Christ remains the one mediator between God and men, see 1 Timothy 2:5, even though there exist other legitimate mediations that depend diversely on Christ, such as Our Lady, the saints, and the sacraments. In a special way, the sacraments belong to Christ. Why? One reason arises from the fact that Christ himself instituted each of the 7 sacraments. The Church makes this historical claim about institution on the basis of her adherence to the Holy Scriptures, to the apostolic traditions, and to the consensus of the Fathers of the Church. Solemn clarification of this dogmatic truth dates from the mid-16th century, when the Council of Trent, after the Reformation, found itself obliged to respond to a major criticism of the Protestant reformers. At the risk of making an overgeneralization, one can say that the reformers acknowledged only those sacraments mentioned explicitly in the New Testament, that is, baptism and Eucharist. Because they denied that these sacraments formed part of the mediation of divine grace in the world, since in the Reformation view, no created thing could become a carrier of divine grace, the Reformers referred to their sacraments as ordinations, that is, commemorative or symbolic ceremonies that the Lord ordained to be repeated by the members of the Church. The Council of Trent devoted a great deal of energy to clarifying what the Church holds about the doctrine and the practice of the sacraments. In fact, the very first canon of the Decree on the Sacraments anathematizes anyone who claims that Christ did not institute the 7 sacraments of the new law. That's a fancy word for condemned. The Fathers of Trent realized that this affirmation entails more than simply their establishing historical warrants for church rituals. They wish to preserve the divinely ordained mediations that God has set up in the Church of Faith and Sacraments. In other words, Christ instituted the 7 sacraments for a purpose that conforms to that of his overall salvific death and resurrection. To put this teaching in personalistic terms, Christ, as the Gospel of John assures us, wants to remain with his friends. Father, they are your gift to me. I wish that where I am, they also may be with me, that they may see my glory that you gave me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. Although after his ascension, The Lord no longer appears visibly on earth. Those who worthily participate in the Church's sacramental economy meet Christ in the sacraments that they receive, and he remains with them. The sacraments make Christ present to us in a way that is altogether unique. The reason for this uniqueness lies in the fact that the sacraments contain powers that originate in Christ's own divine person, the person of the Word. From this source, the Paschal mystery, if you will, as the Catechism states, all sacraments and sacramentals draw their power. St. Leo the Great, Pope from 440 to 461, expresses this tenet of Catholic faith in one of his sermons. What was visible in our Savior has passed over into his mysteries. He means the sacraments, which the Church also refers to as mysteries. The sacraments, then, bring us face to face with the thrice holy God, and for this reason, the Church insists on reverent celebrations of each sacrament. Sorrowful reverence for the sinner who approaches penance and holy anointing, joyful reverence for those who, since they are united to Christ in charity, grow in this godly love when they receive confirmation, Eucharist, matrimony, and for men called to serve as priests, holy orders. Baptism occasions its own special reverence. Speaking of adults, one may call it catechumenal reverence, inasmuch as this first sacrament opens the door to the reception of the other 6 sacraments. The Church teaches that baptism is required of all and can be sinfully refused by those to whom it is presented. If anyone says, warns the Fathers of Trent, that baptism is optional, that is not necessary for salvation, let him be anathema. But otherwise, there is no other mediator through whom the human creature can be united with God. This teaching remains that of the Church and was most recently set forth in a significant papal document, the Declaration Dominus Iesus, an important text that Pope St. John Paul II published during the Great Jubilee of the year 2000. That was yesterday for the Church, by the way. The Church takes care to associate the 7 sacraments with the justification of souls, that is, with the working of divine grace by which we become holy. Indeed, the Council of Trent placed the sacraments after the decree on justification to make this connection explicit. For all true justification, the Council asserts, either begins through the sacraments or, once begun, increases through them, or, when lost, is regained through them. The sacraments belong to the Church inasmuch as she abides in the world as the one ark of salvation, to borrow an expression that is found in a 19th century papal allocution. However, the metaphor that compares the Church to Noah's Ark dates at least from the 3rd century, as a letter by St. Cyprian of Carthage illustrates. What may one conclude today from this witness of the tradition? Christ confided the sacraments to the Church for administration. This administration begins with the apostles, happens today, and will continue until the end of the world. Within the historical transmission of divine grace through the sacraments, so the Church insists, the Catholic priest, quote, is the sacramental bond that ties the liturgical action to what the apostles said and did, and through them to the words and actions of Christ, the source and foundation of the sacraments. We return to the basic theme of Catholic life and belief, one mediator and many mediations. Throughout the centuries, each sacramental celebration establishes a link in a continuous chain of instrumentalized actions in which the risen Christ actively intervenes and thereby makes of them instruments of our justification, that is, of our holiness. Consider the sacrament of penance and reconciliation. As every pope of modern times has reminded us, no Christian can survive without a sacramentalized encounter with the priest who, in the person of Christ, absolves of the guilt of sin, that is, of the penalty that wrongdoing inevitably exacts. Self-absolution creates an illusion of forgiveness. Impenitence leads to spiritual shipwreck. Hence the encouraging words that Pope Francis recently has addressed to us. Everyone says to him, this is very Pope Francis, everyone says to himself, when was the last time I went to confession? And if it has been a long time, don't let another day go by. Go, the priest will be good, and Jesus will be there. And Jesus is better than the priest. Jesus receives you. He will receive you with so much love. Be courageous and go to confession. The church believes as she prays. The sacraments sustain the faith of the church. Those who receive the sacraments may expect to leave the sacramental celebration strengthened in the virtues of the Christian life that animate the whole spiritual organism. We call them the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. Through the sacraments, Catholics will find themselves growing daily in the divine life that Christians uniquely possess. This means that God takes possession of us. The sacraments, of course, are not magic rituals. Each sacrament carries within itself an expression of divine truth that summons the Christian believer to accept one or another aspect of Christ's saving mission. We call these graces the res, or substance, of what a sacrament communicates. For example, in the sacrament of penance and reconciliation, the sinner is readmitted by his or her penitence to Eucharistic communion and to the divine friendship. In matrimony, a man and woman are united in a bond that sustains them for a lifetime commitment to each other and the children whom God sends. And so on with each sacrament, because the meaning of the sacrament is conveyed through the words and actions and symbols stipulated by the Church for each sacrament. No one, not even the priests, may arbitrarily change the prescribed sacramental formula or words used to accomplish this unique sacramental mediation. When this sacrilege is committed, with a big deviation, not a slip, which sometimes can nullify the sacramental action, the recipient is deprived to some measure of the substance of the sacrament. And when the sacrament is nullified, then there is nothing of the substance communicated. Attention to the administration of a sacrament does not amount to some form of ecclesiastical tokenism. The Church looks at a sacrament the way Aristotle looked at all created reality, that is, as a composite of matter and form. This traditional usage requires appeal to analogical understanding. The material elements in each sacrament correspond to the concrete physical realities that the Church stipulates for the celebration of a sacrament. The most obvious examples are bread and wine for the Eucharist and water for baptism. To these created realities, which may include immaterial actions, such as contrition for penance and consent for marriage, the Church stipulates certain words that give intelligibility to the sacramental action. We call these words the form of the sacrament because, like the form that makes anything to be what it is, the form of a sacrament is what distinguishes ordinary bread and wine from the bread and wine of the Eucharist and baptism from an ordinary water bath administered, for example, to infants. Because the graces of the sacraments come as unmerited gifts from God to us through Christ, the Church safeguards and respects the basic constitution of the sacraments, inasmuch as the basic elements of each sacrament originate in Christ himself. As every student of liturgy knows, minor modifications have been made throughout the ages. There have not been, nor can there be, substantial ones, however. No priest, for instance, can decide to baptize with rose petals or use indigenous foodstuffs for the Eucharist, even in those lands that do not produce grapes or wheat. Important as faith understanding remains when receiving a sacrament, the sacraments do not depend for their efficacy on how strongly we believe or how holy the priest is. If this were the case, human beings, not God, would become the measure of the sacrament's grace. Only God measures out the gift of his grace. The Church then teaches that behind each sacrament stands the acting person of God's Son. It is Christ who baptizes, Christ who forgives our sins, Christ who gives himself over in the Eucharist, Christ who confirms us, Christ who unites couples in marriage, or as Bishop Sheen used to say, there are 3 to get married. Christ who ordains a man another Christ, and at the end of life, Christ who forgives and strengthens the Christian at the hour of death. So it is indispensable in the administration of any sacrament that the minister, usually the priest, but also the lay person who baptizes, or the man and woman who give themselves to each other in marriage, to intend to do what Christ and the Church does. This intention makes out of the sacramental sign, action, an authentically human action, instrumentally subordinated to the first cause, who remains Christ as God. Sacraments of salvation occupy a place in the life of the Catholic that no other ceremony or activity can replace. As I have already mentioned, no human person is exempt from observing the sacramental economy. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church, issued by Pope St. John Paul II, does not hesitate to affirm today, and in continuity with the Council of Trent, that the sacraments of the new covenant are necessary for salvation. In other words, not only baptism, but for those who survive beyond infancy, each of the sacraments that a baptized person is eligible to receive form part of the spiritual discipline that Christians must observe. One may regard the sacraments according to a pattern that corresponds to stages in life: initiation, healing, service to the communion of the Church, or according to an order that relates the sacraments to the Blessed Eucharist, which, because of the real presence, holds a first place among the sacred 7. However one looks at the pattern of sacramental life that exists in the Church, each Catholic is bound to receive those sacraments to which he or she is called and which each requires. As I like to insist when I teach the sacraments to seminarians, the sacraments do something. They made a song once. Each sacrament unites the one who receives it, especially to the Passion of Christ. The fathers of the Church like to interpret the blood and water that flowed from the pierced side of Christ as symbols of baptism and Eucharist. The Passion of Christ opens up the floodgates of grace. Because of his love for and obedience to God, the Savior removes the old enmity that kept the human race separated from God's love. One cannot make sense of the sacramental economy within a liberal Christian worldview, such as one finds in H. Richard Niebuhr's 1937, this is a celebrated text, The Kingdom of God in America. A God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. That's not Catholic. Within this understanding of the Christian religion, there obviously exists no room for the sacraments such as the Catholic Church proclaims them. Some may be tempted to opine, well, I'd like a church where I didn't have to confess my sins or bother with other unpleasant or difficult obligations like observing the Church's marriage laws. Many Catholics, whether or not they have heard of liberal Protestantism, do think like that. The answer to such false reasoning is fairly simple. To put oneself into contact with the living God, to meet Christ throughout our earthly lives, one requires the sacramental mediations. No alternatives are known to the Church. One may add, there is no other guarantee of inheriting the promise of everlasting life, happily, because there is an alternative to happy everlasting life. Miserable everlasting lives, on the other hand, are easy to come by without sacramental mediations. Cheap grace supplies a cover-up. The sacraments accomplish in those who receive them devoutly what the Passion of Christ accomplishes for the world. Thus the traditional saying, the sacraments confer grace. Grace means that our friendship with God achieves a new or renewed expression. Grace extends into the infinite. Those who receive the sacraments worthily possess a pledge of future glory, as I have observed above, and this pledge comes with a divine warrant. We need the grace of the sacraments. The sacraments are not decorations in life. Pope Francis pronounced these words in his address to the family pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Peter in 2013. For a variety of reasons that have been explored by scholars, the sacramental theology of the post-conciliar church has not succeeded in establishing continuity with the major theses of the classical instruction given prior to the Second Vatican Council in sacramental theology. There is very little written on the sacraments as the causes of grace. There is very little written on the sacraments as instruments of transformation. So without a renewal in sacramental theology, there seems very little hope of persuading people that, for example, the reception of the sacrament of matrimony provides anything more than added decoration. I would add a decoration that increasingly, in the East at least, people are willing to buy elsewhere than in the church. So I would like to complement the Lumen Civitatis address by applying the general principles about sacramental mediation to two of the questions that have come to fore in the recent Synod of Bishops, the one, and which now, and the 14 Ordinary General Assembly, are being aired, in truth to be told, all over the place. You can hardly open up any Catholic site on your internet browser and not get flashing news of charged discussions. So here are my answers to the things that you've most likely heard about in one circumstance or another. First, the question of failed marriages. Why does the Church not allow divorced and remarried people to choose other marriage partners? It is impossible to answer this question without considering how the Church defines marriage. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, the Latin phrase is stronger, consortium totius vitae, is by its nature ordered toward the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. This covenant between baptized persons has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament. When the Church speaks about a partnership of the whole of life, she reminds us that the man and woman who give themselves over completely to each other in marriage thereby constitute themselves as irreplaceable to each other. Of course, when chastity is observed before marriage, this irreplaceableness is more keenly appreciated and sensed. Still, anyone who enters into a valid marriage creates a partnership of the whole of life. This unique form of friendship arises from the matrimonial consent. Those of you who are married have all said it. You either said, I do, yes, or to the questions that the priest poses to you. Furthermore, the nature of the nuptial covenant explains why the Church holds that from a valid marriage arises a bond between the spouses which by its very nature is perpetual and exclusive. You all know that annulments are declarations that no such bond existed because there is no breaking of the bond. Those who pursue divorce seek thereby to acquit themselves of the contractual promise to live with each other till death, and when they remarry, they place themselves in a situation of public and permanent adultery. This is not an archaism, but a response to the exigencies of a highly personal expression of love. The Church, of course, cannot enable or condone or redefine adultery, because the coital act is the coital act, and you can only be married to one man or one woman at a time, and that has to be determined. The Church also desires to protect the covenant of salvation of which marriage is a sign. In other words, persons who divorce and remarry become ineluctably countersigns of the everlasting love that Christ has for his Church. Why does the Church not invite divorced and remarried persons who often display other personal qualities and religious sensibilities that are lacking in those who lawfully communicate to receive Holy Communion? Those who want to receive the body and blood of Christ must first undertake an examination of conscience. Holy Communion is ordered intrinsically to fraternal communion. We have that demonstrably in the new Mass with the kiss of peace, sign of peace. Worthiness for communion means readiness to love in the truth. In order to receive the Eucharist in a worthy manner, anyone conscious of grave sin must first receive the sacrament of reconciliation before coming to communion. Because the Eucharist increases charity in the just, but does not create it in a sinner, the Church requires that a Catholic judge carefully about whether or not he or she enjoys the state of grace, that is, friendship with God, not vitiated by mortal sin, before receiving Holy Communion. The Eucharist brings a gift of supreme love for those who love God. It is not a magic pill for those who by their public actions show that they do not. While the judgment of one's being in the state of grace belongs to each person, the Church wisely stipulates that those who obstinately persist in manifest grave sin are not to be admitted to Eucharistic communion. As I mentioned above, the divorced and remarried persist in adultery, save in the case of brother-sister arrangements, which is a manifest violation of the sixth commandment of the Decalogue and of the instruction that Christ himself gives about the dignity of married love. So it is wrong to suppose that the divorced and remarried who continue to enjoy the rights of marriage, that is, to enact the conjugal embrace, qualify as profoundly Christian. It also runs against sound Christian practice to make a comparison of them with others who may seem to be less profoundly Christian. Christ himself warns against this all too human proclivity when he preaches the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. It is the apparently sinful publican who goes home justified because he cries out, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." The Church's discipline, which is based on both natural law and divinely revealed truth, causes many Catholics great distress. We certainly know that. What response should the Church give? The Church provides an assuagement for this deeply felt sorrow, which she also recognizes as perhaps a sign of grace active in the person who experiences it. Those who are divorced and remarried are not separated in principle from the Eucharistic assembly. Indeed, they, especially when they bring their children and grandchildren, remain welcome participants of the Sunday Mass and other Masses. Indeed, like every Christian, the divorced and remarried remain obligated to assist at the Sunday Mass. Sinners aren't exempt from Mass, that is to say, exempt from not committing another sin. The third commandment applies. All must worship God. When the time for Holy Communion comes, they are invited to remain in their places to make an act of desire to receive Holy Communion. God welcomes this prayer of the heart, which may even increase the very deep sadness that a person experiences. Such sadness, however, is not necessarily something to be shunned or lamented. The sadness or distress or psychological whatever can be salutary inasmuch as it looks forward to the day when the circumstances of the divorced and remarried person's life change. This change can happen in ways other than by the death of one's spouse, moreover. When in God's providence a change of heart occurs, the person who has cherished a strong desire for the Eucharist, even throughout a lengthy period of time, will be ready to receive the body and blood of the Lord without thereby bringing judgment upon his or her head. See 1 Corinthians 11, 27 to 29. This reminder from the Apostle Paul is a salutary one for all Christians. The person who communicates unworthily brings upon himself a much greater sadness than whatsoever sorrow arises from his abstaining rightly from receiving Holy Communion. Do the divorced and the remarried enjoy their legitimate place within the Church? Of course they do. The Church is a communion of love that embraces sinners. The Council of Trent rejected the arguments of the Protestant reformers that those whose faith is not accompanied by charity are no longer rightfully called Christians. The Church rather recognizes that the abiding character of baptism reserves a place in the Church for every Christian, no matter what his or her moral condition. Some Christians, for example those guilty of grave sin, find their place before the tribunal of penance, whereas others discover theirs at the communion station. All, however, find a place in the Church. As I have explained above, the place in the Church of the divorced and remarried who continue to enjoy conjugal relations is the one reserved for sinners. As befalls anyone who sins, the place in the Church reserved for the divorced and remarried is a place where they can hear the call to repentance, and when they are ready to undertake a way of life that is no longer in contradiction to the indissolubility of marriage, seek sacramental reconciliation. High divorce rates in the Western democracies move people to inquire about the standing of the divorced and remarried in the Church. However, the proliferation of sin, or the sociological spread of sin, can never serve as a reason for the Church to accommodate sin. Still, the temptation is widespread to think that a more inclusive outlook on standing in the Church will increase the Church's relevance to contemporary persons. However, experience shows that when preachers adapt gospel discipline to fit cultural fashions, their congregations do not prosper, but decline in numbers. And this is abundantly apparent, certainly in the Northeast, where accommodationist views have been in vigor for 30 or 40 years, and where, for example, in the Archdiocese of Boston, mass attendance has declined over the past 10 years consistently at 2.5%, which is not decline. Some clerics allow the divorced and remarried to receive Holy Communion in places where their status is not known and so will not give rise to scandal. How should one judge this practice? I would not call this a pastoral invitation, but an invitation to duplicity. St. Paul does not enjoin Christians to communicate worthily only when there is someone present who may recognize him or her. Those priests who offer this counsel may be well-intentioned clerics, but they are also poorly informed, and they promote pastoral harm, not well-being. Those in irregular marriages should be told that what keeps the divorced and remarried from receiving Holy Communion is not only that someone who recognizes them may take offense or scandal. What keeps the divorced and remarried from receiving Holy Communion, as long as they continue to enjoy sexual congress with one another, is adultery. The Eucharist, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, is a pledge of future glory. But those who commit adultery on the authority of the Apostle Paul do not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So this putatively pastoral practice actually works against the Church's authentic pastoral outreach. Each time that a priest makes an individual exception for sin, he removes one reason that would prompt the individual to seek sacramental reconciliation and thereby move closer towards salvation. The Christian faith is not a religion of taboos. The gospel offers new life under the guidance of the new law of love. Adultery, as again St. Paul explains, destroys love. Marriage and family stand at the heart of the Christian life. Within this consortium, succeeding generations come to discover what the covenant of love that God has established with his people means. Divorce and remarriage reduce the natural signification of the partnership of the whole of life, and those who are most deeply affected are often the children of divorce. So moving to another place to receive communion is not a pastoral solution, but a pastoral sophistry, even if appeal may be made to outmoded casuistic practices. Why should good Catholics take scandal when a cleric shows a false mercy and claims to demonstrate compassion and understanding? Priests promise at their ordination to observe that what the Church teaches and to obey her sacramental discipline. The only way that the mercy of God can be communicated to persons who are divorced and remarried is by the regularization of their personal situation, that in a way that conforms to both truth and justice. A regularization, as everyone knows, that Pope Francis has made easier to have examined. Again, only the church can effect this reconciliation within the local community and before the eyes of God. False compassion never serves the purpose of the gospel. Those who try to show mercy outside of the truth enact presumption. And this is a serious sin against the theological virtue of hope. The theological life, the Christian life, cannot proceed on the basis of presumption. And that doesn't apply only to divorced and remarried, it applies to all of us, because presumption is the sin of our generation. We want to redefine sin. Christ has raised marriage to the dignity of the sacrament in order to make it an instrument of sanctification for men and women. Divorce shatters the instrument of salvation that God has instituted out of what remains the most natural of unions between a man and a woman. The Christian marriage is a place where the Christian life is meant to flourish, or what the Catechism calls the theological life. The theological life is the life lived according to faith, hope, and charity. It's a funny word, but it's in the Catechism. They fought putting it in, but sometimes funny words can move people to go and try to just find out what they mean. Where the virtues of faith, hope, and charity shape human love, there the chances for divorce appear most unlikely. Secondly, and more delicately perhaps, why does the Church not recognize gay marriages? What are the principal reasons for this refusal? If you take principle in the sense of foundational, that is, first principles, the answer is natural law. As the late Cardinal George remarked, it's not Mother Church, it's Mother Nature. Complementarity of the sexes explains one of the basic human inclinations that flows from natural law, namely the coupling of male and female. Leave aside the instances of a defect about which no generalizations can be made. And this inclination, the movement of sexual desire, is present in every human being. The coupling of male and female is intrinsically ordered to the propagation of the human race. That should be taught in every biology class. We speak about inclination and natural inclination because of the native ease with which the sexual embrace transpires. A profound theological truth, moreover, that can be verified by the most disgraceful and pornographic of images that are all over the internet, but it's an ill wind that blows no good. I mean, one thing is for sure is that God made the coital act easy. If God had made engaging in sexual copulation as difficult as learning advanced computer technology, it's all right to laugh, the human race would have died out long ago. You know? What? Yeah, no, okay. Why did God make sex so natural and therefore so easy to perform? It is part of the divine plan engraved in the nature of being human, that human beings, that is, the human race, strive to remain in existence. This is, by the way, ignored by every gay activist, as if babies, can be bought in a supermarket. Natural law takes account of biological structures, but is not determined by the conclusions of the biological sciences. So while it is impossible to discuss coitus without at the same time discussing bodily movements of one kind or another, natural inclinations display themselves at every level of human existence. Pope St. John Paul II explained on numerous occasions that the complementarity of the sexes affects the whole person. Appeal of the body and instinct, power of feeling and affectivity, aspiration of the spirit and of will. To cite only an obvious example recognized by all, men and women differ in their psychological makeup. The Church wants to ensure that children are not deprived of the rich complex of human qualities that only a mother and a father can contribute. It is fashionable in some quarters to opine that single and same-sex parents can supply an equivalent kind of care that, as that found in the human family. This hypothesis, however, remains without the support of long-term scientific analysis. And if the Eastern establishment has a say about it, there never will be a long-term scientific analysis. And this finding alone gives us some indication as to why the Church refers to secular ideologies as adversaries of the truth. No ideology, says the Vatican document on gay marriage, can erase from the human spirit the certainty that marriage exists solely between a man and a woman who, by mutual personal gift, proper and exclusive to themselves, tend toward the communion of their persons. She knows that the political order is easily swayed by facile, untested thinking. The problem with ideologies is that those who espouse them can persuade us to adopt a course of action that runs against the well-being of the human person. Genocidal racism affords one example that comes to mind. It's not all about sex. Should not the Church redefine marriage? Definitions can only serve to identify natures. They cannot create natures. Several contemporary philosophical outlooks may leave the impression that naming can change the nature of a thing. That's what happened with the Supreme Court. Reality, however, exhibits resistance to its being manipulated by human ingenuity. The history of theology shows that the Church also has resisted giving her approval to the reductionist instincts of theologians who consider names as mere pragmatic utterances of the human voice. To allow a nominalist line of thinking to proceed unchecked ultimately generates in people a massive lack of confidence in the human person's ability to know the true reality of anything. That bears thinking about. We get swept up into the public exposition of the ideology, and it's like being, on a magic carpet, and eventually you look down, and there, the earth is a long way off, the real earth, and the magic carpet it floats away. It's not easy, is it? If names only serve as titles of convenience and tell us nothing about the inner reality of what they name, then we lose assurance about the power of our capacity to discern the difference between what is real and what is illusion. Because some persons think of marriage as a purely juridical fiction, they also assume without warrant that marriage can be renamed or redefined. Such persons seek to make the word marriage apply to arrangements other than those between one man and one woman. So social welfare does not require the welfare state to redefine marriage. We could have done it without redefining marriage. Marriage and family form the basic building block of society, the original cell, as the Catechism says, of social life. Social welfare issues can be handled without our tinkering with the institution of marriage. Imagine a world where no recognized bloodlines exist, and where the majority of human relationships derive from artifices, such as foster care or even artificial insemination, instead of natural generation. That's the world we're in, by the way, not, the magic carpet is off the ground. In such a world, what the Church has always held about marriage, namely that this institution supplies the foundation for human culture and society, would become abundantly evident. The union of husband and wife reveals the creative action of God. All human generations, says the Catechism of the Catholic Church, proceed from this union. Proposals to keep the name and change the reality of marriage will result only in evacuating marriage of its God-given meaning. That we live with that in the United States because of the Supreme Court decision is another discussion. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, does not enjoy the capacity to redefine nature. It is not a good theological practice to separate fecundity from fidelity. I have remarked above that the natural institution of marriage, even when not raised to a sacramental union between two baptized persons, remains the bedrock of human society. The conjugal embrace is ordered to new life. The widespread acceptance accorded to the sterilization of the mating act, contraception, inevitably brings harmful effects. Fertility rates raise concerns even among secular analysts. Some 15 years ago, for example, human rights advocates wondered why South Asia is missing 79 million women. The answer lies embedded in ideologically promoted discrimination against females. With one-child policy, they want the man, the boy, because the boy counts, the woman doesn't. Still, radical ideologues argue that it is better to cleanse the mating act of its procreative power than to allow the natural finality of this act to proceed. And their voices reach not only laissez-faire Westerners, but also governments that trample insouciantly on human rights. When couples sterilize a particular mating act, they, unwittingly in many cases, separate sexual pleasure from the embrace of the human good that this pleasure is meant to accompany. It's sort of like eating tasty substances that have no nutritional value. You could go on eating them forever and you'd die. Happy, but die. Even the ancient philosophers recognized that pleasure cannot measure the ultimate good for the rational creature. Fulfilled sexual desire alone cannot perfect the union of two persons. It is also illusory to imagine that two people can give themselves over to each other as a total gift and at the same time take measures to hold back what is a most precious adornment of the self, namely human fertility. Now, this is not about contraception. It's simply about what is inherent in same-sex sex. There is no fruitfulness, which is the argument that the Church has always used, and up until the end of the 19th century, for all intents and purposes, the civil governments used to forestall the propagation of sodomy. Pope St. John Paul II calls this mistake a lie. It is very significant that statistics reveal that couples who sterilize their mating acts divorce at rates higher than to those who practice natural family planning. The reason is simple. Those who practice periodic abstinence learn to talk to each other. Communication builds commitment. This sounds harsh, but within a gay marriage, there's not a lot to talk about. Perfect continence represents a difficult ideal to achieve, especially outside of a religious consecration. Why does the Church require perfect continence of those who experience same-sex inclinations? Man is made for love, not for sexual pleasure. That's the first principle put on every door. Not everyone does not need sex, everyone needs love. Love perfects. Sex is there for a specific purpose about which I've spoken. The Church requires that every Christian live a chaste life in order to ensure that every man discover true love. Marital chastity belongs to those who are married and enjoy the right to the conjugal union, whereas the chastity of the single person entails abstinence or continence inasmuch as sexual pleasure knits together no other friendship than that fruitful and faithful union between a man and a woman that we call marriage. That's the second axiom, put it over every door. Sexual pleasure knits together one friendship and one friendship only, and that is the friendship of man and woman in a marriage act that is open to new life. Contrary to all of the polemic, sexual pleasure does not knit together another friendship, and the statistics on that are available, except you could probably go to jail, maybe not in Tennessee, but in Massachusetts you'd probably go to jail if you began to speak about them. It would be considered hate speech. The reason, therefore, that the Church proclaims homosexual pleasuring a moral disorder is rooted in the truth about the human person and the truth about what is good for each man. In other words, it is a positive directive, one that points a person toward the true, not the illusory good. I mean, you have to kind of deny the major. It's not polite to do it. But the major, that somehow, if persons of the same sex generate sexual pleasuring in each other, this is an illusion if the claim is made that this pleasuring knits together a friendship. We find ourselves then inquiring about the sufficiency of pleasure to perfect and to satisfy ultimately the spiritual creature who has been made for seeing God, not for felt pleasure. Of course, many persons require time to discover the basic human truth that only the good perfects, and that pleasure by itself is not a measure of human happiness. In matters of chastity, moreover, many persons find it difficult to live up to the norm. Moral training is important. To make an error about what perfects a human person is the worst mistake that man can make. The Church encourages the development of healthy friendships among all peoples. The psychological and affective capacities of the human person require proper attention. The Church is a place where these features of human personality stand the best chance of contributing to the overall happiness of the human person and not to his or her identity confusion. The reason is that the Church creates its own family, its own communion of love. Wholesale accommodation of homosexuality does not fall among the anthropological universals that scholars identify as common to cultures throughout the world. And if they had found it, God knows you would know about it. It's like the gay gene, that they can't find it, it doesn't exist, and fine, okay. There is nothing else that is so important to remember. Those who experience same-sex inclinations are not barred from entering into the communion of the Church. On the contrary, they are welcomed by the Church. They are welcomed as brothers and sisters, though not as overt gay activists. Within this communion of truthful but not abusive friendship, all persons discover what makes them happy. This prize may not be gained without suffering. But to suffer for something that is true can become a source of satisfaction and personal achievement. On the other hand, to suffer because of one's sins creates emptiness. Reconciliation stands open to all. At the same time, each Christian believer has to avoid the primordial temptation to dissemble before their very selves. In a certain way, Catholics with same-sex inclinations find themselves in a privileged place, if you want. Disordered sexual desires are more easily recognizable than the subtler sins, like pride, that creep in and pervert even those who appear to enjoy a full-bodied psychological and affective maturity. In any case, affective maturity will not be found among persons who give themselves over to disordered sex acts. Generations have discovered that only the embrace of the truth about the good of the human person satisfies. Why can the Church not give some kind of blessing to two persons of the same sex who wish to live together in the form of permanent union? Answer: the Church can never bless ambiguity. Friendship brings its own blessing. If two chaste persons of the same sex find that living together brings them a certain stability and comfort, there is no need for a public act of the Church to acknowledge this kind of human arrangement. Sound pastoral care, however, would seek to ensure that common living arrangements do not afford an occasion for sin. The Church blesses man and woman in marriage because Christ raised marriage to the dignity of a sacrament. Christian marriage entails more than that two persons love each other. Christian marriage entails openness to new life. The Church blesses marriage because from the wedded love of husband and wife issues forth those who will be reborn in the saving waters of baptism. Marriage is a sacrament of service to the communion of the Church. Particular friendships, that is, when two persons love one another in an exclusive way, do not possess the kind of fundamentally human relation to service that marriage by its nature possesses. It is true, of course, two people who love each other may render service to humanity, but they do not render the service precisely as a communion of persons. Being together and communion are not the same. The Church blesses communions, but does not bless publicly free associations of friendship. This is important now because in various states after the Supreme Court decision, the question is, when will the state begin to oblige ministers of religion to bless same-sex unions? If such friendships lead the friends to holiness, then no blessing is required. If, on the other hand, a friendship between two persons affords the occasion of sin, as would be the case if two persons of the same sex were accustomed to indulging and sexually pleasuring together, then the church cannot bless what goes contrary to God's will. The fact of the matter is that, believe it or not, that privately there are norms established for people who live together in certain circumstances, and how often they can fall into grave sin without making their common living arrangements an occasion of sin itself. Those provisions sound somewhat quaint because of the large-scale problem of concubinage among heterosexual persons, but this is not a new problem. It's one that existed before the Second Vatican Council, though not before the Council of Trent. That's a joke. This judgment is not based on an arbitrary decision made by certain churchmen. The reason that the church cannot bless homosexual concubinage is to be found in the logic of divine love. God never blesses what leads men away from his truth and goodness. Given that some persons consider themselves fixed in their attraction to persons of the same sex, what can the church offer as guidance to other Catholics about how they are to love persons of such quote-unquote orientation? The word orientation is not favored by the church to speak about sexual attractions. It's a fairly important point. This is a good reason to avoid the term. Orientation derives from the Latin word oriens, meaning east, as in the Orient Express. Church buildings and mosques have orientations. When the word is used of persons, there is a metaphorical deployment of the term. Still, this metaphor does not help us understand human sexuality very well. In short, orientation suggests something fixed and stolid, whereas the church refuses to hypostasize, that is, to make something so solid as an orientation of moral dispositions. That is, to make particular moral inclinations the fundamental reason for that person's dignity, or for that personal dignity which comes with one's being human. Inclinations or repetitive movements are malleable by nature. If there's such a thing as sexual orientation, it's the biologically established relationship that between masculine and feminine about which poets have sung from the beginning. That's orientation, but the affective movements are not. As is also evident in heterosexual love when people, quote unquote, stop loving each other. When the church says that disordered sexual inclinations never lead to the perfection of the human person, she reminds us that our subjective dispositions may not be reliable guides to the good life. Almost anyone who has indulged in laziness or overindulged in food or drink recognizes that inclinations can lead us away from the truth about the good of the human person as easily as they, when shaped by virtue, conduce to that truth, lead to it. Inclinations require the judgment of reason in order to render them useful for human action. Virtue is the name that we apply to someone whose emotions follow right reason, that is, someone who observes the truth by which God governs the universe. And this is against the argument that says, well, there are people who are fixed this way in their affective dispositions and there's nothing we can do about it, and so we have to... No, there's a lot, a lot can be done about it, and it's not true. Excess and defect never lead to happiness. Psychologists still debate about changing a person's sexual orientation. The church does not pronounce on these efforts. Instead, the church encourages authentic communication and the building up of true friendships among all persons. No one can live alone and in isolation. The church exists as a communion of persons because she knows that untruthful pleasure-seeking can never unite rational creatures that are made in the image of God. The church warns against sexual excess, which is what occurs when people engage in homosexual activity or desire. The church rather teaches that man is the only creature on earth that God has made for himself. We are made for a love that never ends. And this is why sexual pleasure can never replace true friendship. Human loving should not occlude the high destiny that God has accorded to the human person made in his image. As this address has sought to make clear, no one reaches in the ordinary and revealed plan of divine providence the high destiny of beatific fellowship with God apart from the sacramental mediations that one finds preserved and administered in the Catholic Church and in the observance of her moral teachings. Thank you.